Good afternoon. I'm Abdi Boué.
I'm Amy Preston.
I'm Tanya Kekic.
And welcome to Warwick Congress Weekly. Today we'll be discussing the Iranian nuclear deal update, the Gaza protests, Malaysia election results, the new Catalonian leader, and much, much more. But first we're going to explain a bit about Warwick Congress, who we are, what we do, and how we do it.
Warwick Congress is one of the fastest growing student-run initiatives in the UK, and we aim to unite the disciplines of finance, economics, politics and law into a single platform. To stay up to date with everything we do, sign up for our free membership on our website www.warwickcongress.com.
Our hope is that Warwick Congress Weekly can inform our listeners, and if you have any questions, queries or opinions, please message in and let us know. You can do so by going to www.radio.warwick.ac.uk and pressing the message tab on the top right corner. You can also tweet at raw1251am. So, we go to our first story of the day, and it's to do with Congo Ebola outbreak and the World Health Organization's response to this. Can you take it away, Tanya?
Yes, so the new Ebola outbreak resulted in 18 casualties out of 35 infection cases in Northwest Democratic Republic of Congo, according to the World Health Organization. It is the DRC's ninth known outbreak of Ebola since 1976, when the disease was first identified by a Belgium-led team. While Ebola has been endemic to the country, the number of deaths in such a short period constitutes a major cause for concern. On the one hand, the DRC's long history of dealing with Ebola outbreaks has considerably developed its capacity to deal with new ones. But on the other hand, there is no certainty when it comes to epidemics. As with every other disease that threatens global health security, it is critical that nearby countries collaborate with it to make sure that the outbreak stays under control. The World Health Organization already declared in a statement that it is working closely with the government of the DRC to rapidly scale up its operations and mobilize health partners, using the model of a successful response to a similar outbreak in 2017.
So, what has the response been then, Tanya?
Bringing the outbreak under control is a two-step process. Firstly, the RDC's health authorities need to define its scale and investigate crucial pieces of information, such as timing and locations of the infection. Only then can the government respond by attempting to interrupt the chain of transmissions as quickly as possible. Looking at the last similar event, there are reasons to be optimistic about the situation. During the 2014 outbreak, the African Union arranged for health workers from Nigeria to go to Liberia and Sierra Leone. As a result of their initiative, Nigerian health authorities dispose of a high number of health assistants as well as many resources to intervene. There's, however, no space for naive optimism when human lives are at stake. The outcome remains uncertain and will depend on the RDC and its neighbours' ability to address the challenge.
Well, that was Tanya's first story for us at Warwick Congress, and it was a brilliant one at that. Now we move into the Iranian nuclear deal, and we've covered this last week, and we've also covered it in an article as well. For a more in-depth perspective, you can go online to www.warwickcongress.com and read about the wider implications of this. Now, it appears as if Europe is taking the initiative in trying to salvage the Iranian nuclear deal. On Tuesday, the foreign ministers from Europe's major players, the UK, France and Germany, met with Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif and the EU's External Affairs Chief Federica Mogherini. The meeting was designed to keep the deal alive by helping Iran get around the sanctions imposed by the US once they withdrew from the agreement. The initial reaction to the meeting was positive on the Iranian side, with Mr. Zarif stating talks were moving, in his words, in the right direction. In agreement, Ms. Mogherini reaffirmed Europe could not offer guarantees, but remained determined to find a way around the US sanctions and salvage the deal. During a news conference, Mogherini said, "We have a quite clear list of issues to address. We are operating in a very difficult context, and also I cannot talk about the legal or economic guarantees, but I can talk about serious, determined and immediate work from the European side.
So, what's needed for the deal to be saved?
From an Iranian point of view, Amy, assurances need to be made that they will be able to sell its oil and gas, an industry which has been a pillar of economic growth in recent decades. Already we have seen economic or international oil markets suffer from a tension emanating from the US withdrawal. Oil prices have risen to the height seen in 2014, with many waiting to see the effects of the incoming US sanctions have on oil and gas production in Iran. Many hope Russia and China will step in then and safeguard against a dip in production and sort of help to stabilise prices. The EU are confident once the deal is saved that Iran will continue to stick to the agreement and limit their nuclear activity. A senior diplomat said, "What was significant is that Zarif reaffirmed their will to stick to the agreement if we find a way to help them a little." So even after the wind-down period of 3 to 6 months, which the US has stipulated for firms to finish doing business in Iran, Europe wants to know whether trade will be protected. The problem is that finding a solution to US sanctions is becoming increasingly difficult. Boris Johnson isn't exactly hopeful. Speaking to the House of Commons, he said Europe will have to be realistic about the scope of their influence in protecting Iran from sanctions due to the extraterritoriality of the US financial network. He may not be wrong. As faced with a choice between the American or Iranian financial system, foreign institutions are more likely than not to adhere to Trump's demands.
So, is there any way around the sanctions then, going forward?
Well, Amy, the US are trying their best for there not to be. As before the meeting on Tuesday, they announced new sanctions targeting Iran's central bank governor. Valiola Saif was named a specially designated global terrorist, pretty harsh words there, with the US barring any foreign organisation from doing business with Mr. Saif, who is accused of funneling money to help Hezbollah, who the US categorised as a militant group, a militant terrorist group in fact. Still, the EU is attempting to come up with measures to help combat US sanctions swiftly, with many predicting the measures will be announced next week in Vienna. One option could be introducing the 1996-style blocking regulation, which was seen when the EU countered extraterritorial sanctions against Cuba, Libya and Iran. In general, for wider context here, the foreign blocking means an attempt to counter extraterritorial trade restrictions by stopping compliance with the same sanctions that were put in place in the first place. It's clear then that there is still work to do. The US sanctions have opened questions around the degree of economic sovereignty the EU has over US influence, and it's also raised the prospect of a sanctions war breaking out between the two regional powers. So, from one very significant story to another, and this has been in the news quite frequently right now, and it's about the Gaza protests, and Tanya will delve into this a bit more for us.
Yes, so this has been a major news story this week. On Monday, the Israeli military shot and killed 57 Palestinians on the Gaza border, and hundreds more were injured. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, a baby also tragically died from tear gas inhalation. It was the bloodiest day in Gaza since 2014.
So, why are the Palestinians protesting at the border, Tanya?
Well, the protesters are demanding the right of return, which is a right of Palestinians to go back to their forefathers' homes in what today is Israel. Monday's protests were a culmination of over a month of weekly demonstrations, in which around 100 Palestinians have now been killed. But the US decision to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem added further fuel to the fire. To both the Israelis and the Palestinians, the American gesture is seen as siding with Israel in one of the most sensitive issues in the long-standing conflict. Israel tried to defend its actions on Monday by arguing that it opened fire to stop Hamas from breaking through the border fence. Palestinians, on the other hand, accuse Israel of committing a terrible massacre, claiming that the majority of those killed were unarmed demonstrators. Thousands of Palestinians attended funerals in Gaza on Tuesday, which also happened to be the 70th anniversary of the Nakba, which means catastrophe, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled or fled amid the creation of Israel in 1948.
So, how did the world react to Monday's events?
Well, Monday's events have been met with a mixed international reaction. The UK's Minister to the Middle East, Alistair Burt, said that Britain would not waver from its support for Israel's right to defend its borders, but also urged Israel to show greater restraint. Raj Shah, the White House Deputy Press Secretary, went further in defending Israel and said that it has the right to defend itself. In contrast, Turkey described it as a vile massacre and said that the US is partly responsible for the bloodshed. South Africa also condemned Israel and withdrew its ambassador from Tel Aviv.
Tanya, then, what does this mean for future relations between Israel and Palestine?
Well, as many commentators have already noted, Israel's use of excessive force will most likely serve to help Hamas recruit support. The prospects for Donald Trump's peace plan are now seeming pretty bleak.
Brilliant. That was a quite significant story. And another one is coming from Amy right now about the Malaysian election. So take it away, Amy.
Thanks, Abdi. Yeah, it's been quite a historic event this week when we found out that the former Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad scored a historic victory in the general election. At the age of 92, he's defeated the Barisan National Coalition, which has been in power for the past 60 years. Even in spite of widespread electoral fraud and gerrymandering from the party in power, the opposition still won with 113 seats out of 222 against 79 for the governmental coalition. Opposition figures from all around Southeast Asia, some locked out of government for decades, celebrated Mohamad's victory and said they hoped it was the beginning of a wider democratic change in the region. So this election result comes at a time when Malaysia's human rights record had reached its lowest, with the multiplication of repressive actions against Malaysian rights activists, journalists and political opponents. Malaysia was also ranked among the most corrupt nations in the world, with the former Prime Minister Najib Razak at the forefront of a major corruption scandal. The vote marks a bright spot amid dark times, according to the Asian Parliamentarians for Human Rights, a grouping of Southeast Asian politics.
So what's next for Malaysia then?
The transition of power has been smooth so far, and regime change occurred via elections without bloodshed, which constitutes another great win for Malaysia's democratic values. However, this is only the beginning of the journey towards democracy for Malaysia. Prime Minister Mohamad now has to seize the opportunity to put things right after 6 decades of tyranny and corruption. Malaysian politician and human rights activist Nurul Izzar Anwar said, "We want a strong, vibrant democracy where human rights are upheld with zero tolerance towards corruption." He said, "We want a government founded on principle and policies, not personalities." He also highlighted the need to repair the damage caused by the former governments and to reclaim the illicit billions of dollars that have been stolen by corrupt leaders. So Malaysia has finally been given the opportunity to change. The world is now watching to see whether Prime Minister Mohamad will be able to fulfill his promises.
Thanks for that, Amy. Speaking of change, Tanya has an update on another significant development within Catalonia.
Yes, this is another significant development. On Monday, in the second round of balloting, the Catalan Parliament elected the hardline separatist Quim Torra as a regional leader. Torra had failed to win an absolute majority in the first round on Saturday, and the Parliament remained deeply divided during the second round on Monday. 66 MPs voted in favour of Torra's election, 65 voted against, and 4 abstained. Torra's election ends nearly 6 months of political paralysis in Catalonia. All former attempts to elect a new leader since the independence declaration last October had failed because the candidates were either in self-imposed exile or in custody. Torra's election also ends nearly 6 months of direct rule imposed by Madrid last October.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about exactly who Quim Torra is?
So, Torra is an outspoken Catalan nationalist and a staunch ally of Carlos Puigdemont, the former Catalan leader, who is currently fighting extradition in Germany on Spanish charges of sedition and rebellion. Torra only entered politics last December, though, when he was elected to the regional parliament as part of Mr. Puigdemont's Together for Catalonia party. This has led some to contend that he lacks political experience. Torra has been criticised by his opponents for making a series of controversial remarks between 2010 and 2014. One comment, cited by his opponents on Monday, stated that the fascism of Spaniards living in Catalonia is infinitely pathetic. He has, however, apologised for these remarks and has adopted a more conciliatory tone. On Monday, for example, he said that nobody will lose rights. The Republic is for everybody, no matter how they vote, indicating that another independence vote may be on the cards.
So what will Torra's election mean for Catalonia going forward?
Well, the Spanish Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy, has offered talks with Torra, but he has also threatened to reimpose direct rule on Catalonia if the new leader fails to respect Spanish law. On Monday, Torra said that the succession crisis is far from over and pledged to work towards a Catalan republic. His aims include restoring Catalonia's laws, suspended by Spanish courts, and drafting a constitution for a future Catalan republic. New attempts to win independence, such as putting a new constitution to a vote in Parliament, could prompt a confrontation similar to last year, which caused the biggest political crisis in Spain for a generation.
Well, then, it seems there is a trend of change in the air. But in Italy's case, the outcome of this change is still in jeopardy. So, Amy, can you tell us a bit more about the Italian government and their struggle to find a new leader?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently Italy is still without a prime minister. And the Italian president currently, Sergio Mattarella, has granted more time to the anti-establishment Five Star Movement and the far-right League to wrap up a coalition deal. So the two parties that won the most votes in Italy's elections 2 months ago were once competing. One's known as being very populist and the other is anti-establishment. But they've recently joined forces. The leader of Five Star, Luigi Di Maio, and his League counterpart Matteo Salvini met at the weekend, aiming to pick a prime minister who would be acceptable to both of them. But on Monday they met separately with the Italian president, and expectations were actually quite high that the country might have a new government soon. But the party leaders emerged from their meetings to say that they had asked the president for more time to iron out significant disagreements.
So when can we expect to have a clear idea of exactly who will be leading Italy's government?
Well, Luigi Di Maio of Five Star doesn't want the job, and nor does the League's Matteo Salvini. So after much speculation in the press about potential selections for Prime Minister, Mr. Di Maio stated that he and Mr. Salvini have agreed not to publicly name their proposals for Prime Minister or indeed other cabinet members. So it looks like currently we still need to wait a few more days at least. Mr. Mattarella had actually spurred them to action last week when he threatened to impose a technocratic caretaker government. So it looks like if Mattarella is satisfied with their choice of Prime Minister, Italy could have a new government in place probably by the end of this week. However, if no agreement is reached, new elections might be likely.
So what do the two parties want?
Five Star and the League have big economic ideas, and if their so-called contract for change is agreed, it will mean dramatic developments for Italy. 3/4 of the programme that they agreed on this weekend has already been decided according to party sources. Five Star supports minimum universal income for 2 years for people out of a job, while the League has called for a 15% flat tax. The two parties have reportedly reached a deal on a 15% tax for middle earners and a 20% tax for high earners on more than €80,000, or that works out to be about £70,000 per year. The two parties also see eye to eye on tightening laws on irregular immigration from across the Mediterranean. They want to push the EU to change the Dublin regulation, which typically requires refugees to seek asylum in the first EU state they reach. But, of course, President Mattarella has already warned the leaders that Italy will have to stick to its pro-European policies.
So, harsh warnings there from President Mattarella. And speaking of warnings, North Korea has decided to issue one of their own. So, North Korea has pulled out of talks with South Korea, and they've also threatened to pull out of talks with the US ahead of their crucial upcoming summit. So just when we thought things were sort of mending and the relations were getting better between North and South Korea, after they announced a plan to denuclearize the Korean peninsula, things have taken a turn for the worse. North Korea announced that it suspended high-level talks with South Korea as a result of what it termed were provocative military disturbances. So the KCNA reported, which is the Korean Central National News Agency, that, in their words, the exercise was targeting us. It was being carried out across South Korea. It is a flagrant challenge to the Panmunjom Declaration and an intentional military provocation running counter to the positive political development on the Korean peninsula. So quite stern words there. The military disturbances the North was referring to are known as Max Thunder Air Force drills, and they're conducted annually between the US and South Korea. Previously, the North has objected to the drills, which were accused of destabilising the region. The military exercises involved 100 warplanes, included B-52 bombers and F-15K jets. Although in the lead up to the exercises, the South Koreans assured the press that the drills would be conducted, in their words, at a similar size to previous years. Despite the US and South Korea reaffirming the exercises are defensive in nature, the North doesn't share the same sentiment.
So, what do you think is at stake here?
Well, the Korean Central National Agency reported the drills broke the declaration signed last month between North and South Korea, and this was the agreement to cease their hostile acts towards one another. However, the US and South Korea don't see it this way. And even as far back as March, the South Korean National Security Advisor declared Kim understood the military exercises needed to continue. But there is another issue to consider. Comments made by National Security Advisor John Bolton have irked the North Koreans, and this is because they reject the idea of a Libyan-style denuclearization. Now, the reason that they might be a little bit frustrated at being compared to Libya is because Libya voluntarily gave its nuclear ambitions up in 2003 in order to get out from under economic sanctions. The country's dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, was eventually overthrown in a Western-supported coup and killed in 2011. Kim Jong-un wants to avoid a similar fate and sees nuclear weapons as his insurance policy against US military aggression in the Middle East and elsewhere. So Kim said, "It is absolutely absurd to dare to compare North Korea, a nuclear weapons state, to Libya, which has been at an initial stage of nuclear development," he added. He also added, "The world knows too well that our country is neither Libya nor Iraq, which have met miserable fates. Clearly, the Libya model isn't on the agenda for North Korea." Kim also pointed to Mr. Bolton's fractious history with North Korea when he was appointed by Mr. Trump in March. In 2003, North Korea refused to participate in multilateral talks if Mr. Bolton was present, after he labelled the then leader Kim Jong-il a tyrannical dictator. The move to threaten to abandon talks, the abandoning of talks, to give a stark warning to the Trump administration to remember the lessons of the past. Some analysts have suggested that by focusing his statement so much on Bolton rather than Trump, North Korea could be hoping to pressure the US president into sidelining his national security advisor, who is proposing to get rid of nuclear weapons in exchange for economic assistance. Going forward then, the South Korean foreign minister spoke with US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo early Wednesday morning, Seoul time, according to a statement which quoted Pompeo as saying preparations would continue for the Trump-Kim summit, keeping in mind this action of the North. So while some people see this move by North Korea as a sign of that they are backtracking on the agreement made last month on denuclearization, it is clear that there is still some way to go before both North Korea and the US are satisfied. The US State Department has made this clear that it has received no correspondence from the North Koreans about cancelling the planned meeting next month. It may be that this is a power play from Kim to enter the meeting from a position of strength. The North Koreans are perhaps aggrieved at being made to look like they are being pressured into negotiations with the US, and after the concessions they have made, which include suspending nuclear testing, they believe it is time for the US to do the same if negotiations are to continue.
Well, moving on from a quite dense, action-packed North Korea story there. Thanks for that, Amy. And we now go on to the financial news of the week, which Amy again has some news for us on Toshiba.
Yeah, so the first financial update this week comes from Toshiba, where so shares of Japanese electronics giant Toshiba rose 3% on Tuesday, and this rise comes after the company said it's confident it'll be able to cash in its memory chips business, which is used in iPhones. Toshiba also vowed to pay out part of the $18 billion windfall to shareholders, but the company fell into financial trouble following the acquisition of a US nuclear company.
The World Trade Organization said on Tuesday that the European Union helped Airbus with unfair subsidies that hurt sales of Boeing's wide-body jets. But the organisation also overturned a previous ruling that found the subsidies were hurting sales of the single-aisle 737, Boeing's most popular plane. The ruling sees both sides score a win of sorts.
Germany's economic growth slowed to 0.3% quarter on quarter in the first 3 months of the year, from 0.6% the previous quarter. Economists were expecting growth of 0.4% in Europe's biggest economy. The German Statistics Office said domestic demand, construction and manufacturing were stronger, while foreign trade was, in their words, less dynamic. But while the Eurozone posted growth of 0.4% in the first quarter, and this was down from 0.7% in the last quarter of 2017.
Moving to Vodafone then, shares in Vodafone opened almost 4% lower in London on Tuesday after longtime CEO Vittorio Caleo said he would step down in October. Caleo, who's held the role since 2008, will be replaced by Vodafone's Chief Financial Officer Nick Reed. Vodafone announced last week it was buying Liberty Global's operations in Germany, the Czech Republic, Hungary and Romania. So this will significantly increase its footprint in the region. Vodafone is paying 10.8 billion euros, so that works out to be about $12.8 billion in cash for the businesses.
Argentina's peso snapped its losing streak on Tuesday, closing 3.73% stronger at 24.10 per US dollar after the central bank sold reserves, but before the government reported 12-month inflation at a dizzying 25.5%. The bank said it sold $791 million in the spot market to support the local currency on Tuesday. It has already sold billions of dollars of reserves on previous interventions and hiked interest rates to 40%.
Quite an interesting story here. So US-based cereal maker Kellogg says it's pulling out of Venezuela because of the economic deterioration in the country. Workers said that they were prevented from entering a plant in the central city of Maracay on Tuesday. The announcement comes ahead of Sunday's presidential elections. So in a bold but unusual move, President Nicolas Maduro told workers he would hand control of the factory over to them so they could continue to produce for the people. Who knew cereal could be so interesting? So, moving on to another big story here, and it's our weekly Brexit update. Unfortunately, Tash isn't here to give it, but I'll try my best to sort of jeopardise in her absence. So the government will set out a detailed, ambitious and precise explanation of the UK's position on the future relationship with the EU ahead of the critical summit at the end of June, Theresa May has announced. It's expected to include the plan for a customs relationship that avoids re-establishing a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, although there is still doubt about how this will be achieved amongst cabinet members. So, for some wider context here, the customs union refers to a group of states, in this case the EU, that have agreed to charge the same import duties as each other, and usually to allow free trade between themselves. You usually see reduced administrative and financial trade barriers such as custom checks and charges, and also you see economic cooperation. So, David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, told Cabinet that it would be the most significant publication on the EU since referendum. He told Cabinet colleagues, in his words, it will communicate our ambition for the UK's future relationship with the EU in the context of our vision for the UK's future role in the world. Although EU negotiators will not see the proposals in advance, it will be based on previous negotiations.
So what we're all wanting to know, Abdi, is what impact could this have on negotiations?
Well, guys, there's two real options for the Prime Minister and her Cabinet to consider here. The first of which, a customs partnership, essentially involves the UK collecting tariffs on the EU's behalf for goods intended for countries in the EU customs union. The UK would also apply its own tariffs for goods intended for the UK market. Alternatively, there's a streamlined customs arrangement, or MAXVAX, favoured by Brexiteers in the Cabinet, and this involves a customs border being created between the UK and the EU. But it aims to create a border that is as frictionless as possible. According to EU's chief negotiator Michel Barnier, the fuss about picking one of the two options available is pretty much all for nothing. The EU's chief Brexit negotiator reportedly told European ministers attending the General Affairs Council in Brussels that neither the Prime Minister's preferred option of a customs partnership or the alternative maximum facilitation model were, in his words, realistic. The UK is committed to leaving the customs union when it exits the EU on the 29th of March 2019, and ministers are under pressure to agree a deal soon on a successor arrangement. On top of this, time is running out to agree trade deals with the EU member states before the UK officially leaves. Yet it appears as if internal divisions within the Cabinet are hampering the UK's negotiating position. The UK's post-Brexit future is in jeopardy, and the EU are watching as we try to decide what to do next. Now, before we leave you, we feel it's only right to give a summary of all the stories we've covered today. And we begin by starting off the Iran nuclear deal. And Europe's leading foreign ministers met alongside Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif on Tuesday to discuss their response to US imposed sanctions on doing business with Iran. Both Iran and Europe are hopeful that they can keep the Iran nuclear deal alive, although the US have responded with new sanctions designed to further cripple Iran's economy and make Europe choose between Iran and the US.
Gaza witnessed its bloodiest day since 2014, with the Israeli military shooting dead at least 57 Palestinian protesters. Trump's ambitions to broker what he called the deal of the century between Israel and Palestine seems increasingly unlikely.
And it's been a historic moment for Malaysia. The opposition candidate Mahathir Mohamad was elected in the general election on the 9th of May. And his win is even more significant due to gerrymandering going on the other side. And yet he still managed to win hugely. So this has massively overturned the country's political landscape and could potentially open up room for democratic progress.
The Catalan parliament elected a new pro-independence leader, Quim Torra, after more than half a year without a government. Torra was nominated by the region's former leader, Carlos Puigdemont, who has been in exile since last October's chaotic independence referendum. Catalonia will no longer be under direct rule from Madrid and will therefore be able to run its own affairs again. And the Democratic Republic of Congo faces uncertainty as a new Ebola outbreak has already resulted in 18 casualties.
Over in Italy then, the leaders of the two parties, Five Star and the League, are supposedly choosing a prime minister that they can both agree on. President Mattarella has allowed them more time to settle the coalition deal, but no proposal for the future PM has yet been publicly named. If Mattarella is satisfied with their choice of prime minister, Italy could have a new government in place by the end of the week. But should no agreement be reached, new elections are likely. And North Korea has suspended talks with South Korea in protest against military drills undertaken by both South Korea and the US. North Korea has also threatened to do the same for their summit meeting due to take place on the 12th of June. This is the summit meeting with the US. North Korea has been upset by comments made by the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who suggested North Korea could follow a Libya-style denuclearization program.
Theresa May has announced the government will set out a detailed, ambitious and precise explanation of the UK's position on the future relationship with the EU ahead of the critical summit at the end of June. So that's pretty much all we have time for today. But just before we go, I wanted to give a quick shout out to our 2 new members. We have Tanya Kekic, who was on the podcast today, and we also have Sebastian Calder, who unfortunately couldn't be with us, but he did contribute to a number of stories on today's show, so a big shout out to him. So being a member of Warwick Congress has still never been easier, with exclusive interviews, articles and career events for our members. Don't miss out on the benefits that Warwick Congress membership can provide. Sign up now at www.warwickcongress.com. You've been listening to Warwick Congress Weekly, and we hope you have a great rest of the week. And we'll see you next time.